New merchandise available on jg9shop.com. From redesigned 39.6 merchandise to backpacks to ugly sweaters to bucket hats, we've got it all. Plus, now available, we officially have Drink the Spike mugs and glasses, for those who like their drinks more than they like quarterbacks that spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Go to jg9shop.com for the latest JG9 merch for this holiday season. And now, on with our feature presentation. When a player gets cut from a team, most of the time, that's the end of it. It's a relatively quick process. The player gets informed that they're being cut and need to meet with a coach. The coach talks to him, the player says his goodbyes, the player removes his belongings from his locker and cleans it out, and then the player departs the facility. It seems pretty straightforward and not unlike other jobs. You get cut, and then you leave and don't return. You're not hanging around the place after you got cut, just like you wouldn't hang around the office after you've been fired. Even if you could do that, and most of the time they won't even let you do that, why would you want to? Well, let me introduce you to one of the most bizarre and funniest roster cuts you're ever going to see in your life. This is Los Angeles Rams wide receiver George Farmer. Prior to the start of the 1985 season, he was informed by head coach John Robinson that he was no longer going to be a part of the team. But instead of doing what just about every player did after getting cut, which is leave the facility as quickly as possible, he did the exact opposite, and left everyone confused in the process. And this is the story behind the funniest cut in Rams history. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand just who George Farmer is, and why he was cut in the first place. Our story begins in 1980, when the Rams took the receiver out of Southern University in the 9th round of the NFL Draft. When you're drafting players in the 9th round, obviously you're not expecting anything out of them. For some perspective, the year before in 1979, 13 of the 28 players taken in the 9th round, or roughly half of them, never played a single game in the NFL. Even though Farmer was now in the NFL, he knew that he was going to have to prove himself if he was going to stick on the team, especially coming from a small school. The good news for Farmer was that he made it onto the team. He was not cut right away, and was not cut for his first 2 seasons. The bad news was that he was on injured reserve both times, and never actually played it down for the team. Farmer did nothing over his first 2 seasons in the league. In fact, the only thing that I could find on Farmer from that time was from 1981, when he criticized his quarterback, Dan Pastorini, for the way he threw a football. Someone asked him if Pastorini threw the ball too hard, and without any hesitation, Farmer responded by saying, "Hell yeah, too hard." While Farmer was on the team for those first 2 seasons through a technicality, he knew that eventually he was going to have to prove himself, start producing on the field, and spending less time on injured reserve if he was going to stick around in this league. And in 1982, he got that opportunity at the end of the season. Through the first 7 games of the 9-game strike-shortened season, Farmer had done next to nothing, recording 5 catches for 62 yards, and only having a catch in 2 of his team's first 7 games. Then came a performance straight out of nowhere against the Chicago Bears. In a 34-26 loss where Vince Ferragamo of all people threw for 509 yards passing, Farmer had a day to remember, where he led the Rams with 9 receptions for 183 yards and the first touchdown of his career. Yes, the Rams lost the game, but this was a statement game for Farmer, who showed a lot of people that he belonged in the NFL, and who finally got the monkey off of his back by finding the end zone. And after another strong game against the San Francisco 49ers to close out the year, where he had 3 catches for 97 yards and a touchdown in a winning effort that officially knocked the defending Super Bowl champion out of the playoff picture, Farmer was ready to take his game to the next level in 1983. Farmer came out of nowhere over the final 2 games of the 1982 season to show what he was made of, and show that he deserved an increased role in the offense. And in 1983, he got that, as he was able to impress new head coach John Robinson enough to the point where Farmer was able to get a regular spot in the starting lineup. During that 1983 season, George Farmer started every game for the Rams, being the only receiver on the team to do this. Along with having 40 receptions for 556 yards, he led the team with 5 touchdowns. To give you an idea of how solid his 1983 season was, Farmer was one of just 2 receivers in the entire NFC West that season, alongside Stacey Bailey of the Atlanta Falcons, to have at least 40 receptions, 550 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 13.9 yards per catch. Farmer was a pretty solid, dependable, and sure-handed receiver. He wasn't the guy to beat you over the top necessarily, but he was a very solid option on passes over the middle and on crossing patterns. And he played a pretty important part as to why the Rams were so successful during that 1983 season. He scored the opening touchdown of a Week 13 game against the Buffalo Bills, which was somewhat of a must-win game, as with 4 games to go, the Rams were 7-5, tied for the division lead, and with a bunch of teams right behind them in that 6 or 7 win range breathing down their necks for a possible wildcard spot. He had a touchdown in a nationally televised Monday Night Football game against the Atlanta Falcons. And on the final day of the season, needing a win against the New Orleans Saints to clinch a playoff spot in a battle between 2 8-7 teams, in what was essentially a play-in game, Farmer led the team with 4 catches for 74 yards as the Rams won the game. But perhaps his biggest contribution during that 1983 season came the following week in the wildcard round against the Dallas Cowboys. I've talked about this game before, as I talked about the fact that fans could enter the game for free, thanks in part to the game being played in an absolutely awful time, taking place on a Monday afternoon. If you want to learn more about that fiasco and why that was, then click the card in the upper right corner. In that game, the Rams upset the Cowboys 24-17, and with the Rams leading 14-10 heading into the fourth quarter, Farmer scored on an 8-yard touchdown pass that essentially clinched the game. In the span of a year, George Farmer went from a fringe player and an absolute no-name to one of the best and most important parts of a playoff-bound Rams team. However, everything quickly came crashing back down to earth after that. In 1983, perhaps no receiver was more important to the success of the Rams than George Farmer was. But in 1984, everything was a disaster. Whereas he started every game for the Rams in 1983, he started none of them in 1984. Part of it was a regression on his end. Part of it was the emergence of other options at the receiver position. Henry Ellard, the team's second-round pick from 1983, was starting to develop his skill set beyond special teams duty and become a bigger part of the offense. The team also acquired Ron Brown, a second-round pick from the Cleveland Browns in 1983, and a guy who won the 4x100-meter relay for the United States at the 1984 Summer Olympics. And Drew Hill, who missed all of the 1983 season due to an injury, was back in the fold as well. In other words, the Rams were trotting out a completely different cast of characters. And it seemed like George Farmer got lost in the shuffle, especially since he had to miss some time during the season with a dislocated thumb. During the 1984 season, Farmer had just 7 receptions for 75 yards, averaging just 10.7 yards per catch, and failing to score a single touchdown. After catching a pass in each of his first 2 games, Farmer was held without a catch in 12 of the final 15 games that the Rams played, including their wildcard loss to the New York Giants. And at the 1985 NFL Draft, the Rams continued to try and improve their receiving unit, since they only finished 27th out of 28 teams in passing yards and 23rd in passing touchdowns. They spent a second-round pick on Vanderbilt wide receiver Chuck Scott, and spent a 6th-round pick on UCLA wide receiver Mike Young. Once again, these moves continued to push Farmer down the depth chart. By this point, the writing was on the wall. George Farmer was going to have an extremely uphill climb just to make it onto the Rams roster for the 6th straight year. He was the veteran of the group and had the most experience of everyone, which was odd since he only had 1 season of note and had barely caught any passes in every year of his career minus 1983. Sure enough, when it came time for the Rams to make some cuts, John Robinson knew that Farmer wasn't going to make it onto the team. He knew that this was the end of the road. With that, Robinson cut Farmer, ending his 5-year tenure with the team. Now if that was it, and that was the end of our story, then that's a pretty generic basic story where a player just gets cut. There's nothing unusual about this, and there's nothing noteworthy about this. This is what happens in more than 99.9% of the instances that a player gets released. But that's not quite what happened here. Because after he got cut, George Farmer never left. On August 27, 1985, after Robinson announced the cuts, the Rams held practice, like teams usually do, especially since this wasn't the final cut day. And when the Rams held this practice, there was a rather unusual face in attendance. That face? George Farmer. As in, the man they just cut in George Farmer. The man they just got rid of. George Farmer was still there. He wasn't participating in the practice by running drills, but he was participating in such a way where if you didn't know any better, you'd think he was still on the team and was just sitting out due to an injury or something. He was talking with teammates on the sidelines when they weren't running drills. He was walking back and forth on the sidelines, almost as though he was a coach trying to evaluate what was happening. And he even took a moment to talk to reporters, as he talked about how disappointing it was that he got cut. As Farmer said, "I always worked hard in the offseason and in training camp and throughout the season. I was always fighting for my neck. This year was no different. I worked hard in camp. I fought for my neck." You'd think that after a quote like that Farmer would not be at practice, since again, he was no longer on the team. Yet, there he was. And everyone was incredibly confused. He wasn't causing any disturbance or disruption, so from all the reports I could find of the incident, it didn't seem like he was ever asked to leave. This was not a situation like what happened a few years prior with Greg Fields on the Atlanta Falcons, where the police actually had to get involved because he took the news that poorly. You can learn more about that insane situation by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But regardless, Farmer was there, and head coach John Robinson had no idea why. He was just as confused as everyone else. Maybe Farmer wanted one more chance to show that he belonged and to prove the coaching staff wrong. Maybe Farmer didn't get the chance to say goodbye to some of his teammates and wanted to, so he stayed around until he had the opportunity to do so. Or, as Robinson suggested, maybe his ride didn't come. Who knows why George Farmer was at practice after getting cut? What we do know is that this was his last time in a Rams uniform. However, it would not be his last time in an NFL uniform. Sort of. I say sort of because people have strong opinions on whether or not what Farmer eventually did to continue his playing career in the NFL actually counts. But we'll get to that in a few seconds. After getting cut by the Rams, and then not showing up to practice the following day or any other day after that, Farmer tried to catch on to another team. He could not find any team to take him on for that 1985 season. The Rams made it all the way to the NFC Championship that year, and Farmer was a free agent, nowhere to be found. To learn more about that NFC Championship game, click the card in the upper right corner. Eventually, Farmer got signed by the Miami Dolphins in the 1986 offseason, but he was one of the first cuts made by Don Shula and company during training camp. It seemed like his NFL career, especially after not finding any team to sign with in 1986, was over. However, then came the strike in 1987, and then came the scab games. Shula, knowing that Farmer knew the playbook from his few months in the offseason with the Dolphins, brought Farmer on as a scab player. This is why I said I don't know if this technically counts, since people have strong feelings one way or the other on the scabs. However, Farmer did next to nothing with the Dolphins. He played in one game against the Seattle Seahawks in a loss, returned a few kicks, got a head injury, and never played again after that. Thus ended the career of George Farmer. When people think of Farmer today, they most likely remember him for that incredible out-of-nowhere performance he had in 1982 against the Chicago Bears, where he helped Vince Ferragamo get 500 yards passing. Or they remember him from that solid 1983 season of his, where he was the best receiver on the team and caught the game-winning touchdown pass in the wildcard round of the playoffs against the Cowboys. But as crazy and as unpredictable as his career seemed to start, the ending was just as absurd. Going to practice and just not leaving the team facility after getting cut seems like a really weird move that probably would not happen in today's NFL. But in 1985, that was George Farmer's last impression in Los Angeles. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9 and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.